He's going to stand up.
Okay.
So Jefferson Pinder is coming to us from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, where he's a professor of sculpture. He has a BA in theater and MFA in mixed media from University of Maryland. He studied at a solo theater conservatory in Sarasota, Florida. And he's highly regarded for his performance-based and multidisciplinary work. He has exhibited at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Wadsworth Atheneum, in Hartford, the High Museum in Atlanta, the National Gallery of Art in DC, and the Tate Modern in London. And he has won several awards recently. In 2016, the United States Artist Award for Performance, 2017 Guggenheim Fellowship, and Moving Image Acquisition Award. In 2013, he was one of 10 artists commissioned by the UMCA to research the W.E.B. Du Bois Archives, and you'll see a piece in the current show that was also on view at that point in that Du Bois in Our Time exhibition, which is when we first met. In 2021, he was named a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow, and I think you're going to discuss the project you're working on with Smithsonian Collections,
Right.
among other things.
Yes.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Is everybody okay? I just want to check in. You're like, hell no. We're not okay. But, you know, this is a beautiful space. This is just an incredible location. I mean, maybe it's after 3 years of pandemic, I'm glad to be in a space, even if it's a little cold, but that's all right. I mean, I guess what I wanted to do today is tell you a little bit about a project that I embarked on this summer, but I've been working on for over a year. Now, I'm from Washington, D.C. originally. I live in Chicago now, but I consider myself a Washingtonian because that's where I was born and raised. And growing up around Washington, D.C., there's just like a relationship that all people who live around D.C. have with the Smithsonian. I mean, I remember growing up thinking that museums were free. I really did, because I could just stroll into the Smithsonian. My sister, who's 13 years older than me, would take me on the Red Line to go to the National Gallery of Art, and that was a magical moment. I'm going to keep my time to make sure I don't go over 10 minutes. But one of the things that I think was most important was the accessibility of the Smithsonian. And I remember the first time that I went and I asked the people who worked at the museum, like, why there weren't more African Americans in the museum, and I just remember the docent kind of stumbling through the answer. I mean, in all goodness, I mean, she was, it seemed like a very sweet woman, but she couldn't justify why there weren't more black people on the wall. And it's funny, because she said that was the first response was, we have it in our collection, but it's not on display. That was the answer for, it seemed like, years. But I think what I've learned, like being an artist in DC, is my relationship with these museums have changed once I started working with them. And I think that's, I mean, it's what you would expect, but realistically, I mean, I grew up thinking that, you know, the Smithsonian was, let's see if I can forward this to my image.
Yeah, there it goes.
Thank you. Yeah, this is the emblem. You know, I mean, we used to take class field trips there, and it's also just really impressive to see how the museum has grown and how money has changed the institution, and how they've slowly, like, I went from asking questions to the docent to working with curators, trying to figure out how the work would look in a space, which still blows my mind away. I guess I never put those things together when my sister would take me down to the Smithsonian. But the truth is, I mean, I think those ideas were planted in my head when my sister took me to the museums. So last year, I applied for a grant, a Smithsonian Artist Residency Fellowship. And to be honest, I had colleagues who had done it before, and they had told me about the incredible experiences that they had. See, pretty much when you're a resident, you pick an institution or a museum that is suitable to your skills, and you work with them. You find a sponsor, or you find a mentor, and they work with you through the process of a project. Now, the project doesn't have to be, and it's art related, but you don't have to produce an art piece at the end of the project. You have to do the research. I did, because I'm an artist, and I'm just like, I'm not going to work in this museum for 2 months and not produce something. But what I learned in the process will inform me probably for the rest of my career. I am interested in performance, in particular the kind of performance that might that's aggressive. It's blunt. I'm hoping people have conversations about the work. Sometimes it's a little bit more literal. Sometimes my work is abstract, but in the end of the day, I want a dialogue. I don't want to create a monologue in which I'm making pieces, esoteric pieces that are examined by a historian years from now. I want to make something that, like, my grandmother or somebody in my family would be able to connect with and be able to have a conversation of struggle and labor and pain. So one of the things that you do when you put together these proposals is you don't want to make yourself too vulnerable, right? You want to put together something that gives you the flexibility to do a whole bunch of different things. I had an idea. The idea was, like, I love home movies. I believe home movies, I had a great conversation with Ava, who used to work in the museum. We were talking about memories last night, and one of the things is how do you capture memories? And I think few media can capture memories of the past, like, at least for me, like 8mm or home movies in general, but in particular that grainy film footage that is reminiscent of how I grew up. So, to bring this to the point, I wanted to create a piece based on an archive that the Museum of African American History and Culture put together 5 years ago, and it's called the Great Migration Film Series. And pretty much what they do is they invite African Americans to bring in their home movies. They will digitize those home movies, and then they give you the home movies back, and they take the digitization and they add it to their archive. Right now, there's about 900 films, videos, 16mm, 8mm, Super 8mm. I mean, they start in the 1940s and they go to now. So you can go to the Smithsonian with your home movies and say, I want to be a part of this collection, and they will take it, they will digitize it, and you'll be immortalized. So I was like, this is interesting. This is a trove. This is a trove of information. I think I might be skipping ahead of my images here. So there we go. This is the museum. I mean, this is one of the most beautiful museums, I think, on the mall, and is the most recent. Is it here? Where do I point this? There we go. So I'm a little intimidated by it. So I'm in an institution that has Harriet Tubman's shawl, that has a Bible by, Frederick Douglass, and here I am kind of going through the archive of home movies of just anybody. Matter of fact, I ran into, when I was going through the archive, there was a couple friends of mine who had donated movies, and I get to see them as kids. And, Pete, I don't know how the trope of, watching someone's home movies is one of the most painful things that you can do. But for me, I mean, I think that you almost have to get in a particular place, and then you're watching people's memories. It's ephemeral. So what I started to do is I have 900 clips. And there's no way I'm going to go through it. So I'm a professor, and I got two of my best students, and they helped me out. And my God, their names is Josh Spellman Hall and Tony Santiago helped me comb through the archive. And I think there were a couple times I saw something, but I didn't see it. And my assistant would say, "Did you see that? Are you sure you didn't see that?" And then I would go back, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is brilliant." So then the question is, going through this archive. I'm not an archivist. I'm not even a researcher, I'm an artist. So what do you do when you get dropped into an archive? And what I found out quickly is not all archives are documented the same. And what we were doing is we were going through the equivalent of going through old cardboard boxes because there was so little documentation. Because they were figuring out what they were doing. There was an intake in which there was a form, and people had to put their information on the form, but a lot of times the information wasn't put on the form. So I'm using material that I have a signature saying that it's okay for this person to put their work out into the world for me to access it and to use it in the Smithsonian, umbrella. But the truth of the matter is, some of these people aren't contactable, and I'm using their clips, and I want to talk to them. So what I found is that you're really at the disposal of the archive as how they're documenting it, because I have a Sheila Davis in Baltimore, but that's all the information I have, and she has the clip that is in the center of my piece. So the question is, how do you reach out to these people? It's almost like working backwards, it's working beyond the archive, and one of the things I'm probably most upset about in this process is I felt like I was doing more work, or doing the work that the archive, it needed to be done before I was there. And I think that it's okay and it's fair for me to say because I'm lifting the hood and we're talking shop. The fact is that these archives have to be taken care of. And at the end of my project, I felt like I knew more about that archive than the people who worked at the institution. I mean, I'm going through it. I'm looking at every single moment. And what happened is I didn't have a really clear idea what I wanted when I came into the project, which is one of the things that can get you in trouble if you write a really loose proposal, is then you start doing the work and you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? I have this huge archive and I'm not sure what I'm gonna make. And so what we did is we started just examining the clips. And let's see if I can. There we go. So this is the museum. Sorry, can we go to the next slide? Can someone forward it? Okay. So I showed this image. Why? Because this is something that probably most people probably have to do before you get a job. But one of the things working with the Smithsonian Archive is you're working there as a Smithsonian employee. So the same lines that the Smithsonian employees had to wait, and I found myself in those lines as well. And having great conversations, but realizing this is bullshit. You know, I don't have time to be going through the Smithsonian badge line. And it took 3 weeks for me to get a badge to be able to get into an institution in a 2-month residency. So this is welcome to the Smithsonian. This is a bureaucratic system. And also, what is reflective of this system is also reflective of your process when you work in that system. So when I'm going through all the footage and I'm not finding the things I'm looking for, or I'm sometimes thinking that unintentionally people who are supposed to help me are working against me, this is all a part of the process because you're working for a white institution. In this case, even though most of the people I was dealing with were African Americans, I'm working with a system that is the government through and through. And I think that was crippling at times, especially when I needed my badge to get to do my work and I didn't have my badge. I mean, I had to go in as a page, as somebody going to the museum and figure out a way how to get to my office. But that's the process. That is exactly what I'm doing. I'm wrestling with the beast here to try to make something creative. So I'm almost done. Let me show you a few more slides. So the question is, well, what did you end up doing with all of this stuff? Well, one of the things that me and my assistants noticed is that there was a repetition of movement, that in the 60s and 70s, people had this technology, and it's an amazing technology, and they're trying to figure it out. But one of the things is when you're filming somebody, what do you tell them to do? You know? They're a performer, obviously, they're the sitter, but what is your instructions? Well, the instruction that I found to be most prevalent in this collection was moving the chairs out of the way, put on the music, dance. I mean, and I'm sure you'll find this in your home movie collections as well, because I have this in my home movies, but at a certain point, you don't want people to perform, and you want them to do something genuine. So you move the chairs out the way, you put on music, and you have them dance. And then you find out that the uncle with the beer is actually much better dancer than you ever thought he was. I mean, and it was beautiful, because as I'm combing through the archives, I'm finding these beautiful moments of people in Easter, at weddings, so many weddings, at funerals, at any kind of reception in which there's, now you might think it's weird that I mention funerals, but I guess the moment you start thinking you know where you're gonna find dance is the moment you're kind of shot. So what we did is we would painfully watch these clips until somebody would start moving, or the light would change, or the mood would change. And in these moments, it's damn near spiritual. Something happens. There's a shift. And capturing that shift through 900 clips is what me and my team did, and we sewed it together. I mean, I think there's just so many really wonderful things to notice about archives, especially when they're raw and people haven't gone through them. One of which is that you're never sure what you're going to see. You don't know. I mean, people haven't gone through these with the intensity that it really needs. So you could see any. I had a friend I was mentioning last night. I had a friend who was a child when the movie was shot, and she was held by a neighbor, and she didn't want to be held by that neighbor, and she put up a fight. And at one moment, I mean, seeing that in the 1970s and 80s, you'd be like, okay, you know, there's a different sensibility of closeness. But seeing that now, I had to check with my friend to make sure that was an okay moment. And And I think it's these things. I mean, it's truthful and it's honest, and that's what we're looking for as honest as artists. Is we're trying to find the truth, and we're trying to see how that will persevere over time. So yeah, I didn't get through all my slides, but I definitely gave you a mouthful. So thanks for that.
Thank you. So we'll get to hear some more from Jefferson. What we're doing is we
Hang on a
asked.
second. I couldn't hear.
Sorry. Oh, is that this is Karen Kurczynski. Is that Jennifer Allora? I think we have, so Jennifer Allora and Guillermo Calzadilla are joining us from San Juan, Puerto Rico. I'm gonna just do a brief introduction as I did for Jefferson. We're having each artist speak for about 10 minutes and show clips of their practice about how they work with collections. After that, we're gonna ask a few more questions among the panelists and then take questions from the audience at the end. So Jennifer Allora and Guillermo Calzadilla are based in San Juan, Puerto Rico. They've collaborated since 1995. Jennifer Allora has a BA from University of Richmond in Virginia and an MS from MIT. And Guillermo Calzadilla has a BFA from the Escuela de Artes Plásticas in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and an MFA from Bard College. They're internationally recognized for their research-oriented practice that addresses questions of culture, history, and geopolitics. Their interdisciplinary projects question the boundaries between art, music, mass media, political activism, history, and science, among other areas. They were the US representatives for the 2011 Venice Biennale, the 54th International Art Exhibition. In 2021, they began researching at UMass in the natural history collections, the herbarium, researching vertebrate entomology and botany for a future project. They are going to speak today a little bit, hopefully, about that project, which is still very much in process, but also a project in Paris that responded to French Enlightenment history and the zoological collections of the French National Museum of Natural History. So please welcome Allora and Calzadilla.
Hello. Thank you for this invitation, and we're happy to be part of this conference today. And thank you for, again, inviting us to research their collection. And we are looking forward to developing a project in the future together, for sure. We decided to spend this presentation to talk about a film that we made with the Natural History Collection in Paris, as you mentioned. And please forgive our format here, since we're doing this remotely. I'm just going to really describe this project to you while we show the film in the background, so you have an idea a little bit about the actual artwork that we produced, and I'll be telling you a little bit about it as you can watch the film. So if Thomas, you can roll the film and cue it to our voices, that'd be great. If you want, you can lower the volume of it so that I can tell you a bit more about what you're listening to, and you could maybe you can lower it a little bit more. Okay, so. You can hear what I'm going to say. So this film was basically the result of our research into the collection of the Museum of Natural History in Paris, as I mentioned. On one of our research trips there, we met the curator of the collection, Cécile Lecalais, who took us on a tour of the menagerie, which was on the grounds of the Jardin des Plantes. And while we were visiting the rotunda there, she told us this story about a concert that had taken place on May 29th, 1798. And it was organized by 14 musicians from the neighboring music conservatory. The interesting thing is that the audience for this concert was not the Parisian public, but it was rather two Indian elephants, who were affectionately named Hans and Parky, or Marguerite, as she was known in French, who were brought to Europe as a gift from the Dutch stadtholder's collection from the East India Company, who, after being confiscated by the French armies in 1796, arrived after a prolonged and arduous journey 2 years later to France as spoils of war to the Jardin des Plantes. So our film, Apodeme, takes as a starting point this historic attempt against the background of the French Revolution of man trying to communicate and create new relations with animals held in captivity. You have to remember that specimens and live animals from natural history collections throughout Europe, from Italy to Germany to Holland, were commonly seized during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And in fact, they contributed to the fourfold expansion of the French Natural History Museum's holdings, making it at the time the unprecedented epicenter of knowledge production in the fields not only of natural history, but also by displaying the natural order and using it as a basis for social, political, and moral reform. These collections and their spectacularized public displays helped establish the norms, codes, values by which the early French Republic would later define itself. It should also be noted, as William Putnam, who is a writer who wrote about this particular concert, wrote in the Drama Review, he says that the scientists of the Jardin would also go on to insist of the superior value of eyewitness observation of nature's spectacle. So in other words, they were arguing for it being crucial for the collection to have a living species collection in addition to the studying just the skeletons, skins, and cadavers of animals that would arrive in that form. But at the same time, we have to remember that there were numerous wild species and wild animals roaming the streets of revolutionary Paris, competing for food and creating potential danger for citizens. And by decree, the wild animals on loose in the streets of Paris at the time were captured and delivered to the Museum of Natural History, at the time, a fledgling museum, and they had to compete for the attention and resources within the political upheavals of the revolution. In the midst of all of these efforts to define the natural and social world within the chaotic context of the Reign of Terror, there was this truly radical experiment that took place in which musicians, and not scientists, attempted to see if human music might be a possible means to communicate with non-human forms of life. The very concepts of man, life, and nature, and the boundaries between them, as defined by relations of war, captivity, slavery, and other forms of social and political domination and control, were emerging with new meaning in this period. And to this mix is added the question of music as a possible interspecies meta-language, a proto-linguistic, non-symbolic, affective, and transhuman mode of communication, whose basis is biological and evolutionary. By making the elephants the subject of this experiment, the musicians at the Jardin des Plantes momentarily reversed the dynamics of a typical performance setting and made the audience, in other words, the elephants, the focal point of this spectacle. The musicians understood that the elephants were not expected to react to the music they heard by analyzing it using a human language, but for the experiment to yield profound insights into the kinetic nature of the animal's performance, the observers would have to alter and expand their assumptions about the primacy of verbal communication. Because animals move but do not speak per se, they represent challenges to the symbolic capture within representational practices of human beings, even intelligent ones. The concert at the Jardin des Plantes recognized the importance of audience reaction and participation in the dynamics of any performance. However, because the elephant's performance could not be captured or represented in any meaningful human terms, the experiment was never duplicated, and therefore never became a model of scientific inquiry because it was unable to yield results that could be measured by human instruments or observation. So rather than being represented in static symbolic practices of human language that were the cornerstones of knowledge and discourse, the kinetic nature of these animals' reactions basically defied collection, analysis, and codification. So our film, Apotome, centers on the remains of these bones of these elephants that are now housed in the museum Zootech, which is a vast subterranean storage facility where thousands of animal species are collected. In a parallel research we were doing at the time of the film, we were doing research on the human voice. We found Tim Storms, who is featured in this film, and he is a vocalist who has some extraordinary vocal gifts. It turns out that he holds the world's record for having the world's deepest voice. It turns out that his voice can reach notes as low as G-7, which are remarkably 8 octaves lower than the lowest G on a piano. Tim can vocalize sounds so low, in fact, that only animals as large as elephants are able to hear them. So in our film, Apotome, which you're seeing here, is an experiment of another kind. It involves Tim singing to the elephant remains in his unique vocal range songs from that original concert, such as Sa Ira, the revolutionary anthem sung in different keys, to music by Pierre Monsigny or Matandre Mousset, which is like a song that is a popular song of the day, to a concert by Hayden and another piece by Gluck, among other musical pieces that were part of this original concert. That was documented by the librarian of the Museum of Natural History. So there's an actual very clear archive of the music that was played and the elephants' reactions to the songs. So here Tim is now singing those same songs, but in a tone that is barely decipherable to our ears, right? It's little more than a series of buzzes and rumbles that we hear. And the buzzes and rumbles, I should mention, are the sounds that fall within the audible range of our human hearing. The other sounds that you hear, the clicks that you hear at this moment here, the sound, are actually the overtones of frequencies that he's producing with his voice, but which we cannot hear. These frequencies can only be felt if played back through a low frequency speaker system, which is how we normally present the work in exhibition settings. So we experience these songs as drones and vibrations, but the elephants can actually hear these low frequencies. So in a way, Storms is singing, in other words, to them and for them and to their remains. Which brings us to the title of the film, which is called apotome. And the word apotome refers to a word of mathematical division of musical sound. It was created by Pythagoras. He refers to an interval of the semitone in the Pythagorean scale that is slightly greater than half. And this musical ratio doesn't lack in exactitude. On the contrary, it is actually very precise, but it is in excess of human sensation. The normal voice cannot produce it, and the ear cannot detect it. It is an irrational remainder or residue, literally meaning what is cut off. It is a meditation on otherness itself. Not only does the film present the limits of human hearing, it also traces the boundaries of so-called life forms as properly constituted entities capable of perception. At the same time, it revels in the unknowable, in that which, while existent, resists representation and eludes being recorded to any quantitative unit. The film bears witness to these incomplete presences and vibrant remainders, finding in music a measure and reckoning with these elusive forces and the abyss that lies between them. And finally, there's a political charge to this unknowing which equally interests us. The sense of inadequacy and the conviction that human perception cannot process the environmental collapse that is a key symptom of our current era, and in which in many ways was inaugurated during this age of expansion, the colonial period that brought us institutions such as the Museum of Natural History in Paris. We can begin by recognizing that we lack the tools, capacity, and imagination and sensibility to hear the larger world communicating with us in many ways because our senses have been limited by centuries of a certain way of thinking, which has sought to separate as opposed to immerse us within the world around us. Then perhaps we can begin to grasp the magnitude of disorder we have created as a human species on this planet, a disorder created out of the ordering frames we've overlaid over the fluid and dynamic natural world. Perhaps we need to find new methods to feel around in and engage with this vast and unknowable realm. And not to dominate and control it, but rather to better tune ourselves to the complexity of which we are all but a small part. I'll leave you with now a little bit of the film.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. We're just glad that you're here with us too after the hurricane the other week. I know we have a grad student down in San Juan, so we're glad you have power to join us today.
Sorry for being a little bit, academic, but I felt like it was the appropriate way to sort of get into all of the thoughts that were, behind our film, and now we can talk more casually about the process itself. But I figured it was a good moment to get into the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, I would love to hear more. I was letting the sound resonate for a moment, but perhaps we should turn to Alex Callender. And then we'll come back and ask more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
We'll have to appreciate this when we can all see it in exhibit. So Alex Callender will also present. Hi, Alex. Welcome. She's joining us from Northampton, where she's an assistant professor of art at Smith College. Her work explores intersections of myth, colonial legacies, and material culture in painting, drawing, and installation. And you can see actually her work that she's produced for UMass on view at the doorway. You can take a poster home because she's just done a project in relationship to the Bois Archives here. And combining it with histories of settlement and land acknowledgement on campus with our land-grant university. So she's been working on a project that is available as a take-home piece, and there's a poster on view in the show as well. Her work, so it's an example of the way her work incorporates visual forms of historical narratives, archival imagery, and speculative fictions to consider questions of race, landscape, political borders, and environmental instability. She's exhibited internationally with studio residencies with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Drawing Center's Open Session Program, the Art and Embassies Program, the Santa Fe Art Institute, the Vermont Studio Center, Urban Glass, Alice Yard in Trinidad, Draw International, and the Bow Institute in France. She's originally from New York City and was a researcher in residence at the Schomburg Center in Harlem in fall of 2021, working on a project on the history of urbanism in New York. And she'll speak about her collections research there and at the Du Bois Archives for her public art project that just opened. Thank you, Alex.
Hi. I guess we can go ahead and start the slides. Okay, thanks. So hi, thank you so much for having me. I hope there's not too much of a delay. And I'm so happy to join this conversation today. So I'm going to talk about the project that I've been working on at UMass, which started probably like mid-fall last year. Loretta and Amanda approached me from the UMCA about doing like a public work outdoor project. And I was kind of thinking about within this piece, I felt compelled to address, even as a background to the work, what was during the fall of 2021 at UMass, what had been the recent anonymous and deeply racist letter that was written to the Black community on campus. And I think as just like someone who lives in the Piney Valley, I was sort of shocked. And so it wasn't what the work became about, but it became something that was foundational kind of in my background of it, to think about what signifies our ever complex relationship to the word publics, public and publics, and to whom that term is constructed to hold and to make space for. So that was kind of the question that I had. More broadly, my art practice is interested in archival recovery to trace and remap historical materials as a means to explore with both criticality and care how we might disentangle the interwoven relations of race, gender, and capitalism. I draw largely from archival sources in my work to engage the mythic and residual forms of coloniality, to think about ways that we orient ourselves to the past. And so you'll see on the screen a picture to the left of Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois in his home in Great Barrington. There were kind of remains of it. And then on the right is an image of purple lovegrass from the UMass Herbarium digital collection. So there became kind of like this space or this seat for this project I was thinking about, which is about sort of like public memory. But also I grew up in New York City, and so have always lived adjacent to New England. And for me, there's always kind of been this sense of a kind of interior and exteriority to the space. And I think until recently, we haven't always talked about the history, racial history and racial formation in the North, even though our history here is one that is deeply colonial and of land occupation and supremacy, and how these histories are visible or not visible in our landscape. And so recently I've been thinking about lawns and grasses as this place of visibility about this colonial history. So in approaching the archives at UMass and seeing how the archive was in dialogue with each other, spaces within the archive being in dialogue with each other around this question of public and publics, I immediately thought of the moral act and also of W.E. Du Bois as a public scholar. So if you could turn to the next slide. So in this collection of drawings entitled, so the project was called Borderland Where Freedom Grows, and it's a title that's borrowed from the 1949 Du Bois essay, Thinking and Writing. So I was using images and objects from the UMass archival collections, interpreted as landscapes in which people and plants interact with public space on ethereal campus lawns. Drawing from archival images of students engaging in public dialogue and dissent, of protest signage, of solidarity cloth, and strike processions. I wanted to imagine sort of ecology as, and this question of ecological and social history as part of our public. The work combines shapes of native grasses and meadow plants. This is an image stuck between certain parts of the moral act of little blue stem. So love grass, blue stems, and switch grasses are plants that attract pollinators, small animals, and birds, create nesting material, and are crucial to soil sustainability. These and other meadow plants were largely cleared during eras of settler colonialism and were replaced with non-native grasses for cattle grazing and agriculture, resulting in our contemporary lawn grasses that blanket private and public space. The 1863 Moral Act, which allowed the seizure of native lands for public universities, is part of that colonial legacy. So it's sort of like the idea that sort of grasses they become this through their absenting of other ecologies, this constant reminder of the place that we live in and the kind of like violent histories of erasure that have occurred there. So I was just kind of really interested actually in some of the language in here that kind of when Morrill is writing this, there's a crisis in agriculture that's happening in the United States along the Eastern Board, but also in New England particularly, and this sort of dive in wheat and cereal grain yields that have to do with desertification because of the really sort of irresponsible land management by colonial settler culture. So he states that in all parts of the country, important elements in soil have been exhausted, and its fertility, in spite of all improvements, is steadily sinking. So today, as more of the world faces soil desertification, this process of climate devastation, can we see clearly the relationships between ecology, racial justice, and civil rights, which refuse to be understood by settler culture in Morrill's time. So I guess sort of like Du Bois becomes this figure through his public work and public scholarship that sort of poses these really important questions to us. And I was thinking about the history of colonialism and the Morrill Act to the way that Du Bois, through much of his writing, is always asking us these questions of colonial structures that underline sort of like the fabric of our social relationships. So you can go to the next slide, please. So this project was originally going to be a series of banners that were outside of the Center for the Arts. And due to kind of concerns around the integrity of the walls of the brutalist architecture, and for various reasons, the project didn't arise this way. And so it became decentralized through a series of drawings that I made that then get turned into these posters that were in different areas that will be available in different areas of campus. And I actually sort of really liked this movement because it became less about meeting a sense of monumentality with monumentality, and kind of thinking about history in the archive and the way that we very often think about it through these very monumental kinds of moments. And that my interest in archival recovery is also sort of like these very small, everyday sort of spaces and things to think about. So the gesture of sort of moving off of the larger structure seemed, it made sense in the end. I just wanted to show that original picture. You can go to the next slide. One of the collections, so I looked at a bunch of collections specifically, and one of the collections I was really interested in was the Black Mass Communication Project. And I want to thank Jeremy Smith and so many people in special collections who digitized many of these recordings. when the project kind of became no longer had this central space, this part of the project made a little bit less sense, but I was working with Britt Crow-Miller, who is a faculty member at UMass, and we were creating a walk that was this combination of social and ecological history. And one of the things I really wanted was the Black Mass Communication Project, which is this amazing trove of really student-generated radio broadcasts from the late 60s and 70s around so many of these issues of race and place and education and labor and different kinds of civil rights are part of this collection. And so the idea was to kind of use the QR code and have different recordings from this collection kind of pop up as you approach different places in the landscape. This idea that like the archive doesn't have to live in repositories, it can exist with us like outside. And I think that was a lot of this project, was how to kind of externalize the archive, to have it live with us in a different place that also centers ecology. You can go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to, this is a picture of New Africa House during one of the student protests on the right, and then on the left, some of the materials that were kind of like in the Black Mass Communication Project. And this image sort of centers a little bit of the first drawing that I made. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So weaving together materials primarily from the UMass Amherst collection, the Du Bois papers, the Black Mass Communication Project, student demonstrations and protests, Science for the People, the Chester Davis papers, in which I found this image. And then this project hopes to draw archival materials into outside space where we can consider how history lives with us. And this is this wonderful image that I found that is at New Africa House in 1970 or thereabouts, that was taken by Chester Davis, who was a faculty member. And if you kind of go into the foyer of New Africa House, his photograph is sort of in this case where next to where the sort of like posters now are kind of presented. But I was actually at a residency. I made most of these drawings at McDowell in the spring. And there was an elder there that I was working with who had graduated from UMass at this time period and couldn't remember her name, but knew this woman and had also been at New Africa House with her. And so I just love that there was sort of like within the sort of like New England like Black creative community that there was this sense of knowing. And so I did decide to use her within the image of the first drawing for the series. If you can go ahead and turn to the next slide. A really big part of this project was also attending the Du Bois reading groups on Monday morning. I had listened to parts of Black Reconstruction, but wasn't as familiar with like the massive amount of Du Bois materials. And so I wanted to like have a place where people could access actually hearing parts of public speeches by Du Bois. And so just going to the reading groups on Monday mornings, it also just kind of became a way to kind of create a community, and reading groups have been at different parts of my own life really important in sort of understanding a subject matter and thinking about it. Next slide. So this is the first image, and each of these images are paired with a lecture, a public lecture of Du Bois. And so when you access the posters on the opposite side, there's like a QR code in which then you can go ahead and hear Negro History Week, that is in this case read by Cheryl Townsend Gilks, who is also part very often of the Monday morning Du Bois reading groups. Next slide. So kind of going back to this idea of how the lawn kind of becomes this actor or a place in which sort of concerns of the public are played out, and where we become parts of publics, right, by making these kinds of decisions. I was looking in the student demonstration and protest archival collections, and was finding different ways in which sort of like this language of kind of questioning different power structures were then activated outside within the lawns. Next slide, please. I was really interested, I mean, in the kind of ephemera that happens when something is comes through Xerox, which is, I think, also just sort of like this aesthetic part of the archive that I'm always really interested in. It's like this sort of ghosted image, like something that has been drained of a certain time, but has a kind of reversal in its image making. And there's just something that I always respond to in my drawing that has this sort of kinship with the sort of Xerox or a secondhand kind of historical comment. But I was really interested also in, this is a demonstration, anti-war demonstration from the 1970s. And one of the things that is sort of being acted towards is the relationship to Dow Chemical. And of course, Dow Chemical is ubiquitous for sort of land and lawn management, but during this time is also producing weapons within Vietnam. And so it's sort of like this intermixing within ecology and social history and colonial history. Next slide, please. So this is the sort of second image, and I'll just run a little bit more kind of quickly through these so make sure that we have time. This was paired with the essay Thinking and Writing, and sort of really interested also in ways in which, when you're looking within the Du Bois catalog, that often his speeches come with notes. And we were thinking, this was read by Chanel Prince and Aaron Yates for the recording, and there were parts within sort of the speech that we couldn't really read. And it was this question of how to confront that. And so we kind of like, decided within the recording, like, oh, the language isn't really accessible. This is what we think it is, as opposed to kind of trying to find a more finished version, but sort of dealing with the material a little bit as we find it. Next slide, please. So this was an image that is connected to a labor issue, labor strike by graduate students, and an armband that was worn in solidarity. So I think I'm also interested in like how we move from image to image, but also sort of like these traces or remnants of history are kind of connected to actual objects within the archive. Next slide, please. There's also been longstanding kind of histories in student protests on the Amherst campus that kind of question this relationship between students and labor. This is just a shot of the outside of the UMCA. And initially, when the architecture was built, that there were like two kind of reflective pools. And I was thinking about this very much with the essay, The Housatonic River by Du Bois, where he talks about how water is sort of the center of the landscape. And underneath this, if it were to be daylighted, there is the Tan Brook, which is a brook that kind of like is a water system that runs underneath the UMass campus. Next slide. And also kind of finding like just like the amount of kind of ecology that grows by water systems, as opposed to other kind of like land managed parts of lawn. Next slide. And so that kind of became the impetus for this drawing. Next slide. And then there was a sort of like this history again in 1970s that is connected to so many different sort of uprisings on campuses, especially public universities. And one of the outcomes of this were the free schools was the campus-wide strike and free schools that were happening in 1970, where universities and students, both students, staff, and faculty were kind of like bringing knowledge construction outside. And in this project, I would walk around a lot. I went to the herbarium and was sort of walking around campus and kind of thinking about how, for those of us who teach in suburban and sort of like semi-rural campuses, the way that lawns sort of negotiate this geography that is very connected to sort of enlightenment, the remnants of enlightenment centers of knowledge production, right? You have a building that does this, a building that does this, and we sort of clean the landscape for convenient kind of traffic and landscaping between these kind of corridors of knowledge. And what we miss, again, kind of going back to the sort of ecology of meadow systems that doesn't put humans as the central actors within a space. And sort of thinking again into this future in which we're going to have to practice new relationships with ecology. How do we practice this when we're kind of allowed to, we're able to move through space where we don't really have to think about what is lost? So I guess that was also something, where that was kind of occurring to me in looking at these pictures of the lawn, but also when it kind of gets activated. Next slide, please. This was just a kind of connection again of the crisis of tent city, but also housing that was happening on campus. Next slide. And you can kind of just run through these till the end so that I can kind of, wrap up. Our policy is here as a test, our presence here is a testing of policy. And I thought that was a really beautiful kind of phrase that I kind of transferred into the last image that didn't become part of the series, but I thought I would show here. So I will end there and look forward to speaking with everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. So we've had 3 fascinating presentations. I just have a few questions to ask the 4 panelists before we open it up to the audience. So, and they can weigh in whatever order we decide is best or you all want. My first question has to do with the challenges you've all faced in working with different kinds of collections or archives, issues of how the collection material is framed, the politics of framing, and the questions you're asking, issues of access. We heard about Jefferson's problems accessing a very bureaucratic archive that it's trying to transform and become more open to new kinds of materials, Black popular culture, you could say materials that have been excluded in the past, but yet barring his own presence there. We heard from Allora and Calzadilla working with an archive that really embodies Enlightenment principles going all the way back to the 18th century and the post-revolutionary period of classification, and they're doing a project that pushes back against the impossibility of classification. And then Alex, you're working with this fascinating archive that we're proud to have here on campus that is sort of a radical archive of this intellectual who was pushing against the racism of his society in his day, and ours is kind of maybe you could say a counter archive or a radical archive. So I'm curious how each of you have dealt with the politics of how those archives were created, how those collections were created in your projects. Does anyone have a response to mind? Who wants to begin? Jefferson?
I guess I spoke a little bit to it.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear how other people navigate. Maybe I'll jump in, but I think I outlined it really good. I mean, I think we're dealing with institutions that are changing really quickly, and no matter how good intentions they are, I mean, we're struggling with the 200 years or 400 years of history. So, I mean, to me, that's like at the base. But I'm curious from seeing the other artists what kind of troubles or what kind of challenges they came up against.
Guillermo, maybe you want to speak? We haven't heard from you yet today.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the archives are incredible places, but I guess for me as an artist, it's what to do with it as an artist that makes it. I think that's what it's all about, right? Not to represent the archive as it was, or changing the format from the archive to a gallery wall, but how to do something with it. In our case, the interesting story, I guess, was what happens with the elephants, the concert and all that. But then finding the elephant remains in this place, I think that makes the connection of how to translate this event into something else that can yield other types of meaning. And then finding Tim's voice, that was it, right? It was how can we have Tim sing to the remains of these elephants, the same concert from from a long time ago. And then there's all the fun stuff that comes with it, that we need to find how to record Tim's voice. So we use a microphone that is used to record earthquakes because it was so low that normal microphones couldn't get it. And then getting these big speakers that can play that back and see how you feel in the actual space, Tim's voice. Yeah.
It's fascinating that your installations are often so palpable for the viewer, becomes a kind of, you experience it with all your senses, because so often your work involves music and then the sound quality. If we imagine being in the installation where we could feel the vibration, you're both inviting the viewer into the archive as if they could virtually walk through it, but also forcing them to experience the impossibility of communication. To me, it's very much fascinating about the question of human-animal communication and this attempt that's always a kind of missed attempt or never quite communicates the way that we think of speech communicating. So that cross-species communication, and it's almost, it's a very profound kind of feeling more than a statement about that you kind of transmit through the installation.
I can maybe add to that too, thinking about your original question is like this idea of like incommensurabilities, no? Like the fact that, you know, these things that cannot be measured against the other. And even with relationship to the archive itself, I think all of the work that all of the speakers here are doing today are talking about that, this kind of archive that exists, but then the impossibility to really fully, obviously, reveal its, you know, mystery and the possibilities that are within it, right? So all we do are these attempts to try to reach towards some kind of partial meaning that can be created with respect to this other thing, which is in the case of this conference today, right, is the archive, but it could mean also in the case of our film, you know, other forms of being or, you know, forms of life, for example.
Yeah, it really did strike me. We were talking about Hilma af Klint in my class yesterday, so I'm thinking of seances, and when I'm watching him sing to these taxidermied species, it's almost like a speaking to the dead, and the archive is the space of the past, and so it's a very profound piece in that respect. And maybe I could lead to Alex here to weigh in, because your work in a way is an homage to Du Bois and his project and the students who were protesting, trying to revive those actions, which were very much of their day and the specific things that they were facing, but to give them new life in relationship to questions of ongoing life, natural life on campus, and really bring all of these projects attempt to give new life to these collections. What'd you say?
Well, I think for me also, like, working with this collection was really different because most of the materials that I was working with really are housed at UMass. And even there was the Du Bois dinner over the summer that talked about the process of acquisition of his papers. And so in some ways, I kind of really understood where everything had been collected from, which is really different than other sort of archival collections that I've worked with, where there is sort of this question of how things are acquired. So I think for me, the thing that is so compelling about archives, and again, sort of that question of when we get away from the idea that there is some origin or answer exactly, right, that they still hold all of these ambiguities, even though we might have sort of like this, you know, primary historical documents. But the way that they can be in dialogue to each other. And, you know, I think one of the things that I was thinking about in here is kind of these histories of activism or troubling space. And I usually kind of think about like an archival space as like, if I'm troubling the past in some ways, what are the reasons that I'm doing it? So there was sort of this idea of kind of troubling a set of surfaces within the images themselves. And one thing that I do think a lot about is that so many of the images I'm looking at are photographs, right? And so there's that question of who takes a photograph. And so kind of using images or deploying images that, like, when I feel, and this is sort of just a feeling, it's nothing other than intuition, that a person is being captured in a moment that feels, I don't know, like it's really kind of breaking a level of privacy in an unexpected way, I tend to stay away from that image. So I don't know if that's helpful in any way in answering that question, but I think that can be one of the things about, especially kind of dealing with histories around race and kind of questions of the archive and power and authority. So how one selects images to work from and things to work from. And I think that sometimes you know, like I'm sure that in the history of working with materials and projects, I've gotten that wrong at some point, but it's something that I think a lot about. I'm sure that everybody here is like, that's probably one of the things that we think a lot about. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think it just reminds me of something of what Jefferson was talking about in terms of respecting the kind of very private documents you might be looking at. And that the importance of that, I was curious to hear more about that, Jefferson.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as artists, I think we want to explore some of the things that are harder to define, that fall in between the cracks. In some way, it has more flexibility, it's more plastic than if something is definitely this or something is definitely that. I kind of head toward the gray areas and explore, but it also kind of leads you into tricky situations in which, you know, you can't trust the institution to have the best interests of the people who put those archives in place, or that those archives are about, because I think their institutions are moving at a different pace than I think we are as artists. So just jumping into these things, and actually you have to kind of have, at least I did with my project, you have to have an idea of ethics as far, I mean, and I think that, you know, we talk about artists and ethics, but when you're working through these archives, these individuals who that these archives are about, or, you know, as in, you know, we're talking about images, I mean, these are things that you have to have almost like incredible sensitivity to, but at the same time, as an artist, I think you also are pulled to cut something up, to deconstruct it, to break it down, and to hope of bringing it back better. You know, so I think there's this balance between patience and sensitivity, but at the same time, I mean, I think that as much as you have to respect what you're looking at, you have a role to find the truth and to go for the truth. And so, I mean, it's a little bit of a conflict at times, and especially as an artist that really knows what you want and you're trying to get it, but you have to almost like curb yourself to understand that these things are a lot more complicated, and you could quickly find yourself in a situation.
Yeah, I guess that does lead to another question of mine, which was how you all mediate the information, the overwhelming amount of information, the 900, you know, videos you're watching or films or whatever, and, you know, how do you transform it for the public? You each have very different methods of doing that, and I think Alex's drawings, the dark tones of your final drawings do remind me of those Xeroxes that you showed, and the way that the photographs fail to often convey information. They your drawings maintain a kind of sense of mystery that we all could go in and find something different in the collection. And yeah, you all kind of maintain that. You have very different methods of presenting the collection in your work and transforming it. Is there anything else you could speak to in how you reproduce versus transform or respond to the historical and archival materials that you work with?
Well, I think we need to give it up to all of us, because I think we're in danger of extinction. Going and doing hardcore research like this, going to an archive, I don't think much people do that. Normally people just go and look it up in the internet, you know? So
Yes.
doing this, it's something very unique, and I think less and less people do it. And the interesting thing about it is that by doing it, we are going to find things that are more strange or unique, or maybe not in the light that everyone sees. And that can yield interesting and hopefully illuminating results.
Mm-hmm.
So give it up to.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And I'm also fascinated, and I did have a question for you all about how you all see yourselves as kind of public historians. Of course, we have Sam Redman here representing the public history program later today at UMass, but you are all acting as artists in relationship to public history and a sort of, you know, agent of transformation, rendering homage to Du Bois as in earlier, you know, histories of transformation, social change and recorded in people's personal videos, and inspiring audiences. I think you all are interested in audience being, you know, kind of activated by your projects in some way. So if you have any other thoughts before we open it up to audience questions, I'd love to hear how you each, you know, frame your own role in your mind, and how, as an artist, does that give you more freedom than a working historian, or do you consider yourself doing public history in a way? with this archival work? Yeah.
I can jump in and I can kind of maybe bring the two questions together. I think that in a lot of ways, I'm sort of interested in what I think I understand about a subject, and then kind of going into an archive and just looking and the ways that all of these other kinds of systems and questions open up within a set of histories. And I think a lot about, like within this project, the project ends up being about Du Bois, but it is also about sort of this sort of systems of colonialization as they are sort of like living in the history of native land enclosure and also in our present. And it is also about how we decide values in public space, right? And it is also about land management, like contemporary issues of land management, right? Like there's this way in which the archive can present, for me as someone who's just really interested, I think, in history and sort of sharing that, the way that what makes it probably very different than someone who is more informed through the kind of like process of historical production for me as an artist is that I don't necessarily go in with an idea of what I'm looking to find in an archive. And so there's a lot of time that's spent sort of just like looking through and finding unexpected connections. And I usually house a project in a landscape. Like for this project, it became in some ways a meditation about lawns, which seems like a really everyday thing that maybe I wouldn't have expected to think so much about. In another project that I've been working on recently that has to do with urbanization and housing, I was sort of kind of meditating on toile wallpaper and sort of like the history of actual that within sort of like neo-colonial New England toiles, we're actually looking at a history of land management and colonial erasure, like in that picturing, like that pictorial relationship. So I think like pulling things from our everyday sort of social experience and social history. And that's what artists, I think, that's what we do, is just sort of sit into a space and look at it and think about it. And so then kind of like finding these connections within the archive that broaden out that subject matter, that make, sort of different kinds of connections to a place or to a set of histories. I tend to be really interested just as a person in underlining structures. And I think about actually the intimacy of structures, right? That might seem really kind of like far away, whether it's policy or whether it becomes, again, sort of like these, systems of land management, that those are actually everyday, really intimate things. And so that's, I guess, for me, the role that I tend to play.
The intimacy of art can lead to these, it seems like you all are searching for these unexpected moments, these unexpected insights, the moments where people start dancing. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's the unexpected moments that you don't have enough imagination to flesh out. Like for my videos, or the videos that I spent so much time looking at, some of these date from the 1940s, and somebody knew how to operate this equipment, and there's class issues. I mean, for an African American to be documenting themselves on 8mm film or 16mm film in the 1940s, it says a lot about embracing technology, embracing the times. And also, when you see these things change in the 1990s, when you see different groups of people having access to this equipment, it's liberating. You begin to see the change. So in a way, I feel like I'm a witness to an imperfect history, and what I find myself is finding ways of stylistically filling the gaps and where there nothing was written down, because history a lot of times is written in points. I mean, we knew black folks were suffering here and here and here, but here is like a family skiing on the Alps in 1945. So it's like, well, you might have thought something completely different, and I think this archive is allowing you to use your imagination and to build those gaps.
Great, yeah. Maybe that's the point where Du Bois wasn't writing about that family in the Alps. He was writing about all the suffering, and then we have this visual counter archive that shows something else. It's always something else. Jennifer and Guillermo, do you have any thoughts on your role in relationship to the public in presenting these archives, how you transform them, and how you, are you doing a kind of counter history, or are you commenting on history, or are you trying to illuminate it in a more sensory medium, or some combination of those things?
Most likely a combination, but I think our work definitely is experimental. So we're really interested in kind of using the archive as a kind of raw material to then create a kind of new experimental space for something else to emerge from it. So our relationship to the primary material is, again, as a kind of experimental form that we can then use to create something new with, that will create a new set of meanings and associations, but always with a very attentiveness to the historical specificity of the and the material background of the objects that we're using or the subjects that we're dealing with, but it's always in this spirit of this other thing that we want to generate. I think that's what Guillermo was trying to suggest. What new synthesis can come out of that encounter, right? So it's about this kind of encounter, creating this space of encounter for something else to emerge, is kind of our approach to the archive.
Yeah.
And also the medium, like what's the medium of the work? I could do a lecture. I can write a book about it, it can be an educational project, but if you're going to show it somewhere else, I mean, to such a degree, I will say that even though our research is extremely tedious and specific, and that's how we craft the artwork, at the same time, and the artwork will not be anything else without that, I don't feel any need to tell people in the exhibition space anything about it.
So they can encounter it from wherever they're at, or whatever their level of knowledge or background.
Well, in a way, maybe like the archive itself, right? Like in the film, for example, you're going our own. I mean, I think we all probably have this experience, right? When you actually go to a physical archive, it's just this mass of things, right, that you encounter raw, and then there's this impenetrability about it. But then that actually behind it, there's a lot, and it has to come from you to be able to then find a way to connect deeper and sort of peel back the layers of the onion and reveal the richness that's there. But it's there. It's just a matter of how do you access it, right? So I think it's a play between the opacity of the collection and these objects, and then the possibility of engagement somehow and finding a deeper connection there. Mm-hmm. Something I wanted to, it's more of a question that I thought maybe this is a transition to then opening up to the audience's questions, but I find it interesting that in all of our work, there's a moment when we're dealing with medium that is not, just two-dimensional, but we all seem to have had connections with like multimedia, materials, right? So like, audio recordings or film, in our case, not obviously a recording of the concert, but the music itself, we could actually understand what was heard then. So there's this orality maybe that I'm interested in, that we have all engaged with as a kind of another window into the past that we all seem to have gravitated towards. Like, we're not all just talking about images or objects, we're also talking about things that engage with other senses. And I find that interesting, that all of the artists in this panel have had that connection with their projects.
Mm-hmm.
I love that comment about orality. And I think that's a word that I think about a lot in terms of like how we listen to images, which Tina Camps writes about, but I think is a really natural thing, that sometimes there's like voice that is within objects themselves. And then there are, of course, like programming that are meant to be, that whether we're listening to audio files or different things, that it becomes this like different kind of connection that is not one that is simply imaged. It's already a combination of imaginative images and language, right? As opposed to a document that might just be text, or something that already presents itself within an image, right, pictorially. And I think that there's something that's really interesting about this sort of slippage about the kind of imagination that already exists within archival materials themselves, that are kind of like this capture from a previous period of time, and that one that you are in some ways like translating or thinking about within your own contemporary sense of the imaginary, right? And that these objects kind of have, and these things have this sort of double life that you're kind of like sorting through and thinking about and how to position. And yeah, so I love that connection to orality.
Thank you. I'm going to invite anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question. There's a mic down at the front here, and I'll give you a moment if anyone wants to come up. And while we're waiting, I did want to ask Guillermo and Jennifer if you have anything. Did you have any cool discoveries at UMass during the brief moments you just started, I think, to research in the herbarium here and the other collections here? Are there any insights or plans or observations that you made? It must be a very, very different natural history archive than the official Paris Museum. That I'm sure it looks nothing like the rows of taxidermied animals.
No, there was actually I think there's like many different interests that have been piqued by our visit there, and seeing the collections and meeting the faculty who took us around and showed us the different collections. I think, we're in that stage when you first confront an archive where it's just like, you're washed.
Washes over you, yeah.
And there's lots of, percolating interests, but there's, it would be, I couldn't really go comment on a specific thing right now, but there's, it's often also, I should say, talking about process, being very again, like being very sincere about how it all works is like, you just get impressions of things, and then you let your own interests and desires sort of guide you towards certain areas and subjects. And then what I tend to do is then I start to then like go on Amazon and buy like tons of books or like go to a library if I'm at a university and I can have access to them, and I start reading about things that are kind of in that world of interest, and then sorting through what other people are starting to say and write about things that have piqued my interest. Then I can kind of narrow down a question, right? Because in the end, right, in any research setting, right, the most important thing is to ask, what question are you asking in regards to the body, the thing that you're observing, right? Like, what is your question? And then once you define your question, then you can kind of make your experiment, I guess. I guess we have a kind of maybe a very typically scientific approach, but like an artist, a science experiment kind of thing. But our approach is like that: pose a question, make an experiment, observe the results, and then make your conclusion about it. So right now we're in that state of kind of observing, and we haven't yet formed the question yet that we want to ask, and then the experiment is still a long ways off.
Mm-hmm.
No, but there are things that I like about it. Like, one is the wind as something that in the future may be what produces landscapes instead of animals pollinating nature. So the wind as a form that can produce future landscapes. And then whale balloons, the things that the whales have, they're filters. Yeah. And the relationship to stalactites in cave, which are also like filters. I don't know, those two things. I'm not sure what to do with them, but.
Well, we look forward to seeing where it goes. I think we did have a question. Was someone walking? Please, could you speak into the mic, and then they'll be able to hear you.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Adrienne Torf. It's a fascinating conversation. As I'm listening to you, I'm hoping you can help connect what we heard from Ann Pasternak and what we heard from Swiss Beats and what you all are talking about with us. And it's a two-part question. I think the first is really one of creative art or philosophy. And the second, going back to what we heard from Ann Pasternak and Swiss Beats, is when those creative connections cross the threshold into the realm of remuneration in a capitalist, white supremacist environment. The hard question is, as artists who are working with materials that have already been created, with which you are recreating, what is your relationship, Jefferson, for instance, to Sheila Davis? What is your relationship, Jennifer and Guillermo, to the people who performed a few hundred years ago that music, to the people who taxidermed those formerly living creatures, and Alex, to Du Bois and to the students who created those political actions some decades ago. So the hard question is, do you see them as co-collaborators, or as collaborators or co-creators? And then as you cross the threshold, as your work crosses the threshold into institutionalized art and given a value, how would you like those co-creators to be credited on the wallboards of the museums or in the remuneration from the transactions of when your art is then sold and resold in perpetuity?
Wow, I think,
Well,
okay. No, go for it, go ahead.
No, I don't have any relationship with them. I don't know them personally. I mean, they're just, research.
I don't agree with him at all,
information,
by the way, on that.
And they will be credited, I guess. But I don't think that, I wouldn't say that this work is in collaboration with, right?
I don't think so. I think actually different than you. This is also, we have another layer here, which is what we collaborate, and so we have completely different two other minds approaching the same sort of project, which is always an interesting challenge in and of itself. But I think to answer what you're saying is, I think differently than you, Guillermo, for sure. Like for example, in our case, that's this concert that was created, the selection of music and the way in which it was orchestrated originally certainly plays a role on how the work that we made today. And so those musicians who created that concert in 1798 certainly are in some way, we are in dialogue with them. And it is an extension 200 years later of a project, a question that was raised then that we are now trying to bring into the future. And I think that's a meaningful and interesting, transcendence of time and space that happens, and that I do think, in fact, there is a connection there, and I find that really an important one. In fact, I don't think that it's to be obvious that it's not connection. I think there is one there. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree.
So Adrian, I just want to say that it's a great question. I mean, that's one that I wrestle with. I mean, actually, I was told to get a lawyer to help me. And whenever you're told to get a lawyer for something, especially as an artist, but what it is, I think there's a sensitivity that I'm going to have that the museum doesn't. For example, everyone signs these release forms that has their footage in the Smithsonian archive, that it can be used for Smithsonian purposes. So as an outsider who's working with the archive, I have permission to use it. Now, if I wanted to show it here at UMass Amherst, I need another release. And so part of it is I think that I'm going deeper, and I'm trying to find connections with families. So I've reached out to as many people that I can, and we've started. We're going to have an event. But then there's Sheila Davis. Then there's the Sheila Davis, like you mentioned. There are people who I have the name, and then I check in Baltimore. There's 31 Sheila Davises. And how do I begin to go about it? And then I'm angry, too. I mean, because I want to make something creative, but here I am, I'm finding myself in the minutia because it is important. So I think what it does is you bring up a point that I think is really important, but it is probably a little bit more on the cutting edge, because I don't think these people were being cited 10 years ago. So it's like, well, what does it mean to be an artist right now? And one of them is like, you need to find Sheila Davis or think about taking that clip out. So that's where I'm at right now with this, and I'm frustrated, which is, I'm sure you can hear some of it. But at the same time, I mean, I feel it's essential to create a community with the Ps. I want everyone to come together and look at my Ps, and to understand how this brings us together, and because I don't think I have too many opportunities to do that. But with archives, I think with this, in this case, maybe not the other artists, but in this case, I have the chance to get as many of these folks together, because 5 years ago they donated it. So most folks are going to be around. But I think as time goes on, I think that my connection with these individuals is obviously it's going to be harder to maintain these connections if I don't start right now. So I know that's an imperfect answer, but it's a great question. It's something that we all have to think about.
Yeah, no, it is a really interesting question. I think especially for those of us who have these sort of like ties to historical material. In regards to the question about the students, I mean, I think one of the things that kind of came up in this project for me is about the continuum and the continuity of holding kinds of forms of radical resistance that when histories of this nature kind of after a certain time period get covered over or they get papered over or they become less in a kind of critical consciousness, it feels somehow like we're starting from the beginning. And I think that when we look into radical histories or histories of resistance, we're not. There's this kind of continuum. So for the students in these images, you know, I mean, I see them, I see myself, I see, right? Like I think that that was sort of the way that I was approaching those images. When it comes to images of language from people that are still sort of potentially with us, that kind of conversation that Jefferson was just having about how we track people down, I don't have a good answer for that. And I think sort of like being an artist with a certain set of resources that I have or ways of knowing how to do something, that's still probably something that I'm learning how to do. A lot of the materials that I have worked with in the past in terms of historical research tend to be of the colonial era. And since I'm sort of focused on histories of women, particularly Black women and women of color, those names aren't there. And there's a certain amount of imagining into archival materials. And that's where the sort of speculative aspect comes from. When it comes to like a character like Sam Morrill, I mean, he's a documented person. And I don't know how much personally I feel that much like I need to give further credit or acknowledgement than who he already is, right? So I think it depends on who you're dealing with from the past. And those are positions of power and they're positions of the way that institutions have been built to give visibility and personhood to certain people and to take it away from others. You know, my position to the archive, especially within institutions, is that I'm sort of interested in taking things that have been collected there and finding ways to externalize them. And I feel like that's what all of us are actually also doing. How that you know, for me, working with archivists and librarians who are like the unsung heroes of most places, have made a turn into these really like particular ethical conversations about collections and how things are placed. You know, when I was doing work at the Schomburg last fall, like I give so much gratitude to the librarians there. They are doing part of the work that is how I make my work, right? And so that's something that's always stated in the projects that I'm working on. So I don't know if that answers the question around sort of remuneration. But I guess that's how I would sort of like frame my position. And I'm, again, is sort of like figuring out a lot of these things as one goes, which might sound like a cop-out. I don't mean it that way. It's sort of a question that I think needs to be posed to us. I also think that like it's different when you're an artist working in an institution and then like the question of institutions. And like, I think that this comes up a lot. It's really important. Institutions have to change. I also think that institutions are large, unwieldy spaces. They have financial commitments of which we don't know, right? And I think that that's why the kind of primary, like, what are you doing within sort of the service of history and these materials? And if it's sort of to make it visible to a kind of public discourse and help transform it more into public history than to something that's sort of like housed within an institution. I think that that's really kind of like the seed of the work that I am being pulled more towards doing.
I would love to hear from the 3 or 4 of you actually about how the work then reaches, how it interfaces or if it interfaces with the commercial art world. Just going back to the question and what Swiss Beats was saying about artists, you know, don't get royalties, which, you know, it is a really big question. I know all of you have been working, you know, to some degree with UMass as a public institution, commissioning your work, showing your work in places like the Venice Biennale, which is the, you know, this big public funded institutional, you know, settings where the work is actually shown, but are you also interfacing with the market, and how does that impact the way your work is made in terms of this research all the resources that have to go into the extensive research to make the work? I don't know, I'm just curious if you're all primarily working on public commissions, or how you work with the problem of the contemporary art market, which is something every artist has to kind of face and deal with.
I can say for our case of the film, it was a commission by the Autumn Festival in Paris. So it was it's a public program that happens every year. And so it was commissioned by the festival to produce the film. And since then, we've just shown it in institutional contexts, and we've never sold anything from there. It's just existed as a work that exists in public institutions, because as you can imagine, it's not exactly something that is easily collectible. So it's not a piece that you can buy and put in your house.
Sure.
So yeah, and that's fine. That's just the nature of that work is meant to be exhibited. And fortunately, we had, which is the key thing, right, is that we had the access to the collection through this festival. So I would say one of the things that I am very much interested in is like the privileged position that I think artists have to have this sort of unprecedented access to these collections. And I have to say that I think that is something that I should acknowledge, that it's, and I think there's a great privilege that we have to be able to just say, oh, I want to go into the Natural History Museum of Paris and dig around and give me your top researchers to explain to me what this is about, or come to the University of Massachusetts and have your top professors giving me a tour, taking their time to show me what they're doing. I think that's an amazing, privilege that I have as an artist working, and having that ability to have people's time and have access to these things, and oftentimes the generosity of the institutions and the individuals who make them up to then, let me go wherever I want to go and go as deep as I want to into these different archives is amazing. So while there's not a commercial necessarily outcome to it, that's not the point anyway. That's not why I'm doing it. And I'm grateful that I have these opportunities, with budget, with grants and so on, to do these kinds of investigations and make the kind of work that is made in those contexts. Which I guess, to answer your question about the commercial art world, that it really has nothing to do with it. At least in our case, we haven't had any for projects like that anyway. There hasn't been a translation into the commercial art world.
Thank you.
Also, I think that at least something that we try to attain in our work is that it cannot be reduced to one single thing, right? If it's reduced to a political dimension, or if it's reduced the whole complexity of the work to an economic dimension, or if it's reduced to the archive and its relationship to the archive, I think it fails. It's a pet, it becomes institutionalized. I think it needs to be more like a monster, right? That has like multiple dimensions and you can never box it down. And
So you're resisting the market through the very format of the work, you could say.
Yes.
Jefferson?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, it's just, I want to have a conversation. I haven't figured out the money. I figured, that'll come when the work is good, or when somehow, like, I get it to a point where I feel I can negotiate and talk about that. But then, as Adrian was saying, there's just a whole other layer of that. I almost I like the idea of just making a nice piece and having a great conversation about it. Now, if it leads to commercial, opportunities, absolutely. But I don't think anybody's going to be knocking on my door right now. So we'll see. And again, trying to find the integrity of the work. I think that's the most important thing.
But didn't you say earlier in our earlier conversation that some of your work will lead to an installation, multimedia kind of installation, rather than like a finished, video that could be sold? I don't know.
Right.
Like something that, as Guillermo was alluding to, is a little bit more difficult to encapsulate and therefore promote in terms of commercialization. It demands a certain engagement, a level of engagement,
Right.
experience.
Yeah, trying to figure out how this can be commodified. Oh my God, this is just such a, but you're right. I mean, it has different like ways that the work can be presented. And I think I'm excited about that, and excited about the artistic like opportunities that, you know, creating something unique is going to provide. But like, I guess I have. I mean, maybe it's a great question. I haven't thought much about it, but I still am. I guess in you know, trying to figure out like almost the mechanics of the work. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I think that also is like, as a teaching faculty, and I think because of the nature of my work that tends to be more research-based, I have found a more natural kind of pairing with sort of college galleries and sort of nonprofit institutions and different, those kinds of spaces, as opposed to having more of a commercial presence. And I think I kind of maybe echoing, that's just a little bit where my work has found a little bit more of a ground, especially since it takes time to, I think, kind of really develop a project and go through research-based practices and sort of develop a work. And there's something about sort of like perhaps the pace of commercialization also that maybe wants you to move at a slightly different scale. But I sometimes kind of resist a little bit the idea that there's really different motivations and perhaps sometimes really different money that is like guiding the commercial world of the art market to the institutional world of the art market. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, there's very elite institutions and there's not, right? So I think that that's a really complex and like huge on its own kind of conversation about how we kind of track a sort of ethic of maybe kind of making work within a frame of social justice or within a sort of ethic or value, and how it interfaces with how it's consumed, right? It's a really difficult question, both because, you know, I think that they're visible and they're not visible and they're kind of intertwined, but also like, you know, I also need to make a living. So I, you know, had found a little bit more the place where I feel comfortable is sort of like in a world where a project can be presented and distilled through panel discussions and through working with students and through talking about what's embedded in the work. I mean, it's sort of like the place that I like to really hang out, so to speak, is not just in what something kind of results as in an artistic object or project, but like what are the components of it? And that's the thing that very often I really like want to be able to talk about with people, right? Because you can't put all everything, you know, a piece exists on its own. And then I think maybe this is true of all of us who are here who do this certain type of work. We like talking about the nitty gritty of how it got to that place, right? And all the ideas involved in it. And that just lends itself so much more to these types of interactions and spaces to show work in.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time, but we look forward to continuing all these conversations. I appreciate so much all of these practices that really give us time and space to engage with these collections and with, you know, time is such a commodity we don't have today, and we're out of it right now. But we will continue the conversation this afternoon. Thank you all for participating. It's great to see you, and we'll talk more over lunch.